PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Thomas Bruscino and George Marshall's Memoirs of My Services in the World War, 1917 to 1918.
As the United States entered World War I, George Marshall was a captain who had been in the Army for 15 years. He would finish the war as a colonel, having proved himself as a gifted staff officer. Joining me to talk about Marshall's experiences during the First World War is Tom Bruscino. He is an associate professor of history in the Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations at the U.S. Army War College. Tom, kind of set us up here for this period of Marshall's life. Where was he in his career?
So George C. Marshall, at this point in his career, is he's a captain, as you said, a fairly junior rank in the military. He had gone to Virginia Military Institute, which was not the premier way of going into the Army. It's still West Point at this time, although that's sort of changing. The Army had become more of a meritocracy in this era. It was starting to become this way, and one of the ways it did that was through schooling. He had gone through the Command General Staff College and made a reputation for himself there. It was a 2-year program. He made it into the second year and did really well. He gets the reputation at the time of this phrase, this word that keeps being applied to him as a wizard at military stuff, at some of the higher level stuff. And at this point, he had gone around to multiple positions, but at this point he's an aide-de-camp to a general named J. Franklin Bell, who is a kind of forgotten guy in American military history, although a very prominent person. He started off working as an aide-de-camp for Bell out in San Francisco in the Western Department. Then he gets transferred. They get transferred, and he goes with them to the Eastern Department of the East in New York City at the start of the war. So that's where he is.
So the war begins. The United States declares war, and does the work that he's doing change at that point?
Yes, it changed for everyone. It's a dramatic uptick in effort for everyone at this point, and sort of keeping in mind that the United States Army is very small and in many ways unprepared, but not in all ways. And we can talk about that as we go. But so he is. What they're trying to figure out is how to get over into Europe and start building up what would become the American Expeditionary Forces, the full forces of this. Marshall doesn't go with the very, very first crew. John Pershing and his main guys who start the AAF. John Pershing is given command of the American Expeditionary Forces, or what would become the American Expeditionary Forces. They're not sure at first how this goes, and starting in April of 1917 when we declare war. But by the summer, they start heading overseas, and Marshall wanted to get into the fight as best he could, and Bell, having some pull, but himself too sort of senior and broken down to be one of the guys to contribute in the fight himself, the best he could do was train forces at home. Bell could, and then he recommends Marshall for a role in what would become the first division. At this point, they're just called they're not called the Infantry Division yet. They're just called the First Division, and Marshall wants and gets a role as the operations officer for the First Division, and he heads out and sails to Europe in July.
Now, he does write a memoir of his experiences during the war, and in reading that, one of the words that I see throughout that is preparedness, and the opposite of that, unpreparedness. And can you talk about the preparedness movement and what that word would have meant at the time?
Yeah, so it's a complicated thing, and I think this goes to this point of why George C. Marshall in World War I is such a fascinating character. We have a tendency in the United States to sort of filter everything through World War II. World War II is our big war, as opposed to Europeans. World War I is sort of formative for so many of them. But for Americans, we tend to do this for World War II, so we have this problem. And because George C. Marshall is so prominent in World War II, that we tend to put everything on his efforts in World War II, and that World War I is prelude to that. And it is. There's no doubt about that. But that kind of needs some explaining. and let me put it this way. If all George C. Marshall had ever done in his career is what he did in World War I, then he would still be a very prominent, he'd be a very important figure, but no one would have heard of him. So we kind of go back and look at that. If we go back and look at the World War I stuff, it both helps us explain what he's able to do in World War II later on in his career, but it also helps us understand what happened in World War I better. And one of those things is preparedness. The United States military is often dinged in World War I and dings itself about preparedness issues, but the preparedness problems are sort of focused at the higher levels and then the lower levels. That kind of requires explanation. It requires explanation because war has become so complicated. Industrialized warfare has become so complicated that it's very difficult for most observers to really understand, even students of war. We have a tendency to think of war as, general makes decision and then whole armies move and do things. It's a very Frederick the Great, Napoleon model of warfare, but it's not that way anymore. Wars fought at all different levels and involving all sorts of resources, all of the resources of the nation, put into these vast, complicated field armies, these big theater organizations like the American Expeditionary Forces and what that is. So the preparedness is the primary problem is at the highest levels, the War Department in particular. They're not really organized well. There have been attempts at reform in the first part of the 20th century to improve the War Department, but at the time, those really hadn't come into fruition. The War Department is kind of fractured. They haven't really planned that well for this. They certainly hadn't planned in much detail for going into Europe and fighting because that wasn't their major problem at the time. They were thinking about defending the borders, Mexico and Canada, and dealing with like the Philippines, holdings in the Philippines and Cuba. But those are much lesser problems and different problems than going to Europe and fighting a war against major modern militaries like you find there on the Western Front. So they're not really prepared for that, how to ship them over there, how to train everybody, how to get them into the fight. The other way they're not prepared, like I said, was at the bottom. Because the Army's so small, they don't have enough troops. They don't have enough trained people who know how to fight, even in the most basic ways, even at the smallest levels, even how to fire rifles and work in teams. Let alone dealing with artillery, tanks, which are becoming a thing, airplanes, which are becoming a thing now in this war. So, but where they are prepared better than they usually get credit for is what George C. Marshall had done, which is prepare to lead large organizations, large military formations in war. They spent a lot of time in the schools thinking about that. They had studied European warfare. They had developed their own theories and their own doctrine about how to do a lot of that. And that's a big, complicated problem, how you lead field armies and corps. I suppose it's probably worth reviewing for people that this is the structure as it goes down, but you start with some sort of theater command. The American Expeditionary Forces is one of those, led by a general headquarters. And then you go down to field armies, corps, divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, companies, down to platoons and squads. And so what we're talking about is really at this division, corps, field army level. They had put a lot of work and thought into that, and they were pretty well prepared. And George C. Marshall's one of the best prepared guys to do that. Now, he's too junior to lead most of those formations during the war. But they're so complicated, leading these things, that you really need to have really well-prepared staff officers. And now they don't have a lot of them, but the ones that they do have are pretty well prepared for that, and George C. Marshall's the best example of all in that.
Talk a little bit about promotions and rank at this time. He had been in the Army since 1902, and he was a captain. Compared to today, that's probably a really long time to be in that position. But once the war begins, promotions would come a lot faster. Talk about what it's like to be a career Army officer then.
Yeah, so it's primarily a seniority system with a little bit of leavening of meritocracy in there, but especially promotion to general officer is difficult. And again, it's probably worth going that you go second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, brigadier general, so one star general, major general, lieutenant general. And in the United States military, we don't really have 4 stars at this point. Pershing becomes the first one of just a general officer. World War II, we'd come up with 5-star generals. There are a limited number of slots at every rank, especially for general officers. Usually people have to come to their mandatory retirement age, and then they're replaced on the list, and it's a very difficult path. And sometimes people are jumped Pershing jumped people who were ahead of him on seniority list, sort of famously under Theodore Roosevelt. And there is some talk about Marshall going to that, but he doesn't get the jump as much. Now everybody gets a jump in the war, but these are all temporary ranks during the war. So a whole bunch of people get moved up because, like we said, we have this big, vast organization, and you need to have senior level people to both command and then be on the staffs of these big formations that we're talking about, the AAF, the first, the armies, the field armies, the corps, and the divisions. But so everybody gets pushed up. Everybody who has some experience gets pushed up, and a bunch of people who don't have experience get pushed up into these senior ranks. And this is one of the problems: is where do you put those people? The people who know how to fight and lead a regiment in a fight. Do we take somebody like Marshall who has the experience to do that and put him in command of a regiment, or is he so important that we need him and so experienced that we need him at a higher level somewhere? And that's the problem he kind of runs into. And as it turns out, he gets sort of stuck in his rank because he's so good at his job that they won't. He's so good that they won't promote him. They won't put him to positions where they can promote him. They won't move him to line positions like in command of units. So they don't put him in charge of a regiment. They don't put him in charge of a brigade. They don't put him in charge of a division. And even the staff position he has is that he ends up, his final position as the operations officer for First Army is a colonel slot. It's not a general slot. So he's doing the work of many of his peers who are in brigadier general spots, but he doesn't have one of those spots except for right after the armistice, and at that point they freeze all promotions, and he's stuck. So at the end of the war, he ends up going back to being a captain briefly, and then they make him a major. So that it's a fascinating thing to have these people who are in command of these huge formations going back to their pre-war ranks, to their permanent ranks. It's a very complicated story about how rank structure works in the military, but that's kind of the thumbnail version of it.
So as Marshall and the 1st Division, they arrive in France, what do they do at that point? What needs to happen for this division to be combat ready?
Okay, so the 1st Division has to, they have to, well, the number one thing to understand about the United States military at this point, and this is commonly misunderstood, is that they're very much a learning organization. They're very focused. Many of the leaders have kind of mentioned, where they get prepared. One of the places they get prepared to lead large formations is in the schoolhouse. Right? So they study a lot about this, and then they run maneuvers and exercises as best they can with the limited number of people that they have in the military prior to World War I. But they still manage to do some pretty large efforts. I mean, in one of these cases, this is kind of going back here, but George C. Marshall does maneuvers in the Philippines, and he's an XO and executive officer. He's sort of a junior guy who ends up taking over for a whole formation and planning the whole thing, and his fitness reports end up having multiple. He has multiple people. I'm unaware of anybody who had these. One of the questions on fitness reports is, would you want this person to serve for you again? And on multiple occasions, and this is mind-blowing, he had people say, yes, but I'd rather serve for him. Promote him past me, jump him, he's a captain, you should jump him and make him brigadier general right now. In any event, the 1st Division becomes the kind of seedbed for the AAF. It's the 1st Division that's out there. For a minute, Pershing thinks that's all he's going to command. They're not sure how many people are going to be able to go, and then the war effort ramps up and he has a whole theater to command. But they end up putting a guy named William Seibert in charge of the 1st Division. He's the commander. And then they have a whole staff and subordinate commanders who end up being the senior people throughout the AAF. But this is kind of their test bed for it. But as a learning organization, what they do, a lot of the leaders of the AAF and 1st Division, they spend the first months of the war going and learning from the British and the French. Studying from them, setting up training areas where they can practice these ideas about what's going on in World War I with their own bent on it. Their view is that the European powers, both through sort of exhaustion and habit, are sort of stuck in this trench warfare, stuck in this limited way of fighting, and they don't want to stay that way. They think that in order to win, they need to be able to be more offensive in how they fight, and so. Anyway, in any event, Marshall is part of this process of learning, surveying the Western Front, trying to figure out where they're going to fight when they get into the fight. He helps out along with this. I can't emphasize this enough. It's a team effort. Marshall is very good at being part of the team. He's got a more limiting role as the G3, the operations officer, what would become the G3. This is the modern staff structure they invent in World War I in the AF. He's in charge of operations and training, so he has to do that. And so he goes out and works on that, on the training effort for 1st Division at first. But it takes a long time. It takes a long time. This is, to sort of put this in perspective, by the end of 1917, so declared war in April, by the end of 1917, there are most of 4 divisions that are in the fight. I think I have the numbers here somewhere. There's only 180,000 U.S. troops that are in Europe at this point. There's 4 divisions they're fighting, and then there's a lot of they're starting to bring in support troops, people who can run the ports and the railroads and do all of the the shipping and the logistics for moving forces around. But they have a very limited number who are in the theater at this point in the war, and it's very slow. And this happens to coincide with probably the worst part of the war for the Western Allies. The Soviet Revolution has happened in Russia. They're going to drop out of the war. The Italians take a pretty bad beating in Caporetto in the fighting, 1917. There are a couple of French and British offensives that fail pretty miserably. So it's very much the darkest time of the war, and what started with great hope of the Americans coming into the fight looks pretty dim and disappointing at this point. This goes back to the War Department problem, inability to ship troops over on our own, requiring British shipping, primarily some French, but primarily British shipping to get American troops over there and then get them trained up, and it's a mess. Along the way, so this is really important. The Americans make the decision after studying the Western Front, studying the French and the British in this fight. The Americans make the decision to make really large divisions. They have 28,000 man divisions. These are roughly twice as big as any European divisions are. This is the main combined arms formation, primarily artillery and infantry in this period. Sometimes cavalry, but not so much in World War I, where you're using horses. And the Americans decided to make them very large because they think that these divisions, when they look at the problem of the Western Front and the trench warfare as it's set up in these very fixed positions, they know that they need fighting power. And so they set up these very large divisions to do this stuff, which creates additional problems in how to fight. But this is their solution to it. But they take a little bit longer to build up, and with the shipping being as slow as it is, it's not going particularly great for all of this. You throw into the mix, because it's not going great, that the French and the British especially would really like the Americans to just be manpower. So we end up with this big controversy, this amalgamation controversy that happens in World War I, which is that the British and the French would really like the Americans just to be manpower. We want you to fill in our forces that are depleted. We already have smaller divisions, but they're even smaller because many of them are undermanned from all the attrition of the war. And so they'd like the Americans to fill in with the troops, and the Americans, the guidance that Pershing gets from President Wilson and Secretary of War Newton Baker is that, hey, listen, we want to be independent in this fight. If we're going to have a role at the table at the end of the war, when we're setting up the peace negotiations, we need to be independent. The Americans need to make their separate mark in the war, and Pershing takes that guidance and says, hey, so the Americans are going to be a separate fighting army on the front. So this creates all kinds of problems, which in the history have led us to sort of almost forget that the Germans were the enemy in World War I, not the French and the British, because they fight about this repeatedly. And the British especially the British, keep trying to push the Americans to come in as manpower replacements for their troops. So, this leads to some additional issues. That what's funny about that debate, though, is from Marshall's perspective, he doesn't see, and really most of the guys in the fight, we like the big flashy discussions about this. We like the soap opera fights about this stuff. The British saying the Americans don't know how to fight; they should just be part of our armies, and they do stick with that view. The French less so, because they see a little bit more of the American contribution, and they'll take the American contribution any way they can get it, keeping in mind that the Germans are on French ground. And they really want them gone. So they'll take the Americans however they can get them. And I think Marshall, one of the things that happens in this, it's important to remember the Western Front, World War I, as much as we think of it as war-torn Europe, the truth is that the Western Front is a pretty small place, right? So you could drive, these days, you could drive to most of the active parts of the world of the Western Front in one day across Europe. It'd be a busy day, but you could do it. And which means that like large parts of France, these training areas in particular, are pretty far from the front. And Pershing ends up going to Marshall ends up going to Gondricourt to do some of his training. He gets in with a French family that he ends up being very friendly with. And I think this is important because they're kind of welcomed. They're welcomed there, right? The French want the Americans there. The French people want the Americans there, and he sees this, right? He lives this, that they're very close allies. For all of the fighting over where the troops should go and how the big strategic decisions should work out, at the end of the day, they're still allies and they're still on the same side. He keeps this in perspective. One of the great things about Marshall is that he doesn't have much time for these debates that he thinks end up being kind of silly, right? This is kind of silliness and it's a distraction from what we really did. And I think part of that's from being in this training period and being around the French people and keeping in mind what this is all about, which is winning the war as an alliance. And that's the way it turns out. And so Marshall's perspective is very important on that, I think.
Now, there was at one point an incident with General John Pershing and Marshall where Marshall perhaps got a little ahead of himself for a man of his rank. Can you talk about that incident? Yeah,
so Marshall, we look at the pictures of Marshall that we have here and we see him later on. He has a reputation as being kind of an austere person. He's almost like Pershing in the same way. Pershing has this, tended not to show his emotions or his more friendly, his sort of jocular side in public, and Marshall ended up being the same way. But they were both individuals, sort of George Washington-like in this case, buffeted by strong emotions, a very, and Marshall sort of eventually put on a more affected view of being a more disinterested, dispassionate kind of person and more analytical. But this was a good example of this. And maybe it's because Pershing was the same way and did the same thing, that he understood that when this event happened that we're talking about, that there's something I kind of like about this guy, Marshall. And what happened in this case is the 1st Division was in training. Pershing came to see them do a maneuver. It did not go as well as Pershing would have liked, and he was primarily blaming the division commander and the key staff of the division, but he was really after the division commander. And in front of everyone, all of the leadership there, he chewed out the division commander in front of Marshall, and Marshall took exception to this. He was still at a younger age, displayed his passions more often, and so as the G3, as the operations officer, he actually tells Pershing that he's wrong about his critique and that he's misunderstanding the problem and all of the issues that the 1st Division is trying to deal with all the problems of getting troops overseas, getting them equipped, getting them into the training areas, and what they had done. And Pershing goes to leave, and Marshall actually puts hands on him, which is always sort of fascinating, grabs him by his arm and says, "No, you need to understand," and gets in a verbal fight with Pershing. And everyone who witnesses this says, and Marshall's sort of famous for talking a lot when he got excited, and so he talked and he laid it all out in detail. But it was all very very well done, but it was very frank, especially for this young officer to tell the overall commander, General Pershing, what was what. And Pershing, everybody thought Marshall's career was over, and Pershing actually ended up turning out respecting it. And in the weeks and months that followed, whenever he went to 1st Division, he'd go to Marshall and ask him what was going on, what was the real deal. This is the start of this relationship that Marshall and Pershing that would end up being extremely close in the years to come. So it did not work out that way, and I think it was because maybe Pershing saw a little bit of himself in Marshall, and that he liked that people were frank with him. And it's much to Pershing's credit, and this happened on multiple occasions where people would kind of chew him out from below, and he didn't usually punish people for that. He punished people for inactivity, and in this case, it's interesting because pretty shortly after this, he fires Seibert and sends him home, the division commander, himself, which is part of the whole system in World War I of removing officers who are not active enough, who are not leading in the way that Pershing thinks that they should.
Well, that was another example of Marshall's temper getting out ahead of him there, where he was, in his anger about how Seibert was treated, he was set up to be into a position of chief of staff for the incoming general, Bullard.
Right.
But his temper affected that. What happened?
Yeah, so Robert Bullard, it ends up, Robert Bullard, who's a very problematic character. I would hope that people might want to study him. He's an interesting guy, very competent, also a seething racist about his stuff, and kind of an independent-minded guy. When Seibert gets fired, Marshall makes his temper gets a little out of control, and he makes a point about saying that he thought that was unfair how that happened, and Bullard thought, well, maybe you don't have the equilibrium to be my chief of staff right now, and so Marshall ends up staying as the operations officer when Bullard takes over, but he was tabbed to be the chief of staff. Probably hurt his progression some, but it ended up probably being for the best.
So as the 1st Division goes through its training process, it finally does get its opportunity to go into the line in the tool sector in 1918. So at that point, how does Marshall's very much involved in training and organizing the division early on, but now that as they enter into the front lines, how does that change his role as a staff officer?
Well, the 1st Division being the 1st Division, it's well named, ends up being in the fights first. And one of the things that the Americans are trying to do is use 1st Division as a kind of proof of concept for this open warfare way of fighting that they're talking about doing. And this is where it gets very, very complicated. Open warfare is this much derided idea by historians, primarily I think based on a misunderstanding of what it is. Open warfare is not just a tactical thing. This is the way it's often misunderstood. In fact, it's often misunderstood as Pershing being overly focused on people with individual soldiers with rifles. The way we have to think about open warfare is at all levels throughout the AEF. Remember, we said it's a big, large organization. I listed all of those formations, all those echelons of command that go. So think of it this way: open warfare is meant, it's sort of a philosophy for how they want to fight on the Western Front in World War I. It's not some thing that would work everywhere else. It's based on their study and based on what they think the French and the British might do, especially the French, if they were capable, if they had the troops, if they hadn't been fighting the war for all this time up until now and had been heavily attrited and exhausted by the war. So it sort of starts at the bottom with, hey, we need a bunch of individual troops who know how to fire the rifles and move and get after it in the fights. We need squads that fight a certain way. They need to be thinking less about fighting in trenches and more about moving and spreading out and moving forward. At higher levels, the same sort of thing happens with companies, battalions, regiments, and brigades. Divisions, it means something different. Divisions, as we said, they're these big, massive formations. They're meant to have the frontline guys fighting a bunch of individual troops who are very good at moving forward and using their rifles, fighting as teams, using their artillery, and then as they fight themselves out, they're replaced by units behind them. So when we say that there are 28,000 troops, they're divided in what's called a square division. They're made up of 4 regiments. There's 2 regiments. Basic idea is that there'd be 2 regiments forward, 2 regiments behind them, right? And then so when the first 2 regiments got exhausted from the fighting, doing all of the open warfare things that they were supposed to be doing at the lower levels, the next 2 regiments would come up and replace them in the fight. That's the idea of it. Often misunderstood in World War I is that the corps are also meant to be squares. They're also meant to be made up of basically 4 divisions in the fight plus a reserve division that's behind. So same thing, 2 divisions would fight forward. When they became exhausted, they'd be able to be replaced by 2 divisions behind them, and then you'd have another division that was in reserve that could come in and fill in wherever they needed to exploit whatever opportunities were there. And then you needed a whole big, vast supply system that could support that too. You needed a whole philosophy across the board of how to do that. And that's what they meant by open warfare. It wasn't about troops with guns. It wasn't about ignoring trench stuff. It was about understanding the trench problem, which is that the Europeans had done a pretty good job of figuring out how to fight into the first part of the trenches. But when they got there, they had spent so much time doing that they couldn't figure out how to go beyond that. And even more problematic, and this is where Marshall, this is a big long story that happens from the beginning of the war all the way up until August, September of 1918, when the Americans do have an independent field army of their own. Is that the tactics develop. They expressly write this, and Marshall contributes to writing about this. He uses his experience at the lower levels, and then he takes them into the higher levels as he goes, understanding this philosophy. And everybody kind of understands what Pershing is trying to do, and because he doesn't just develop it himself, so he develops it with everyone else. So that by the summer of 1918, by August, Marshall contributes this great document called Combat Instructions for Troops of First Army. It lays this whole philosophy out about how they want to fight, and this starts with the First Division in their small problems, which is basically trench raids, starting to figure these things out. What that problem comes down to, though, is, and this is the dilemma of what they have to solve. They have to figure out how to fight into the trenches the way that the Europeans have, which requires this very exquisite, super detailed planning effort, right? So because you think about creeping barrages, you use artillery and your troops have to follow them, 100 yards, 200 yards behind the artillery as it's moving forward. This requires really strong timing, clear timing. It requires very detailed boundaries of where everybody goes. But as soon as you get there and you get into the open, you've broken through some of the trenches and you've got some of the enemy in retreat, they're trying to fall back to their next lines. Your next problem is how do you prepare people who just spent all their time learning how to follow these really clear orders, these very detailed plans. Now don't follow the plan. We're going to give you an objective that's off in the distance, and we need you to figure out the problems on your own. We need you units at these lower levels to figure out your problems on your own. Americans see this as a really difficult problem. They're having trouble getting the troops in. As they start to get the troops in, they've got to train them for both of those aspects of the fight on the Western Front. How do you fight into trenches and follow orders very clearly, and then how do you operate more independently once you get past the trenches? As it turns out, the Americans think that their major effort is going to be in 1919. That's when they think they're going to launch the offensive and they're going to have all this, which gives them more time to train. It gives them more time to build up these big corps, to have all the divisions in place, and be able to fight this way, to use this open warfare philosophy that goes from top to bottom. You have troops who know how to do this, and have leaders who know how to use these large formations to make this happen. That's not the way it turns out, in part because of these problems of 1917, because of the collapses at the end of 1917 that lead to the spring of 1918 and the fight there.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
How is he distinguishing himself as a staff officer during this period?
Yeah, it'd be very easy for him to get lost. And like I said, I think that the most important thing to remember is that the First Division ends up being the seedbed. Because it's the only one that's there, they put a lot of their best people there. Names that we don't generally hear about now, but are important. Bullard is one of them, who ends up being the commander of it. They have brigade commanders like Charles Summerall eventually becomes a brigade commander. They've got staff officers like Campbell King. John Leonard Hines is one of the division one of the unit commanders underneath that division. Which means that when Marshall's doing the good things that he's doing in First Division, he's getting to know the people who are eventually, as this army grows, as the American Expeditionary Forces grow, they're the people who are in leadership positions all over the place. And because he's so good, he's so competent at what he does across the board, everybody would like to have some George C. Marshall as this fight goes on. I think it's probably the best way to describe it. We can talk about what that means in the summer of 1918 here in a minute.
Okay, well, let's go there. In the summer of 1918, he does move up from division to the general headquarters. How did he get plucked out of that position, and what new role did he have? Okay,
so we have to keep in mind that in the spring of 1918, everybody understands the situation. The Americans are coming. They're coming slow right now, but they're on their way. They're trying to ship them in. The Germans know this. The Germans have an advantage at this point because the Russians have fallen out of the war, because the Italians are have partially broken because the British and the French had their struggles in 1917 too, and the Germans know that they're going to have to try to win the war in the spring of 1918, that they really need to give their effort there, and so they launch what was known as the Ludendorff offensives. These go from March, April, May, and then into the summer. There's sort of multiple offensives that General Ludendorff commands, directs. They don't work. This is the short version of it, right? They don't work. Although they show some tactical brilliance, but they're not really smart about where they attack, and they can't really follow. And they have that same problem we're talking about. They figure out how to get through the trenches. They're able to actually get pretty deep into the fight, but they don't know how to sustain it, how to build up the fight for it. Nevertheless, it appears that the war is in this, and there's a crisis on the Western Front, and everybody feels this potential crisis on the Western Front. And at this point, two big things happen. One is that the Western powers finally actually make a real alliance, military alliance coalition, and they put, which the Americans suggested from day one when they get there, they actually put Ferdinand Foch, the French marshal, in command as the generalissimo, and this creates this kind of unity of command. Everybody takes strategic direction from him. This is an important effect, probably an unintended effect of the German offensives, but it is an effect that happens. And the other thing that happens is that the Americans somewhat come off of the idea of not amalgamating their forces, not integrating their forces into, at least for the crisis. During these offensives, the Americans start to, Pershing says, we have enough divisions around that I can give you divisions temporarily, French and British commanders. I'll give you divisions temporarily, and you can put them into the line to help blunt this offensive. And then, but when this is over, I'm going to call them back, right? That's his idea of it. So what happens is the 1st Division goes into the line, into the fight. At first, the American divisions go and replace French divisions elsewhere on the line so that the French divisions can go back into the fight. You have to keep in mind that the American portion of the Western Front, from the initial surveys, is a spot where they thought they could have a great effect, and it's also a spot where that's as far away from the British as they can be, so they could not have to deal with the British constantly asking them for troops. They didn't really want to be next to the British, so they're next to the French. The Americans go into the line. The Americans end up going to a place called Cantigny. Marshall, they do a limited fight there. It's kind of, it's in a spot where the initial attack was, the initial German offensives were. The American attack goes pretty well, and they hold out. And Marshall does a good job planning this and setting it up. And the 1st Division, in its sort of debut in the fight, does well enough to show that they can contribute, and the American divisions can fight on their own. And Marshall has a key role to play in this, which leads us to the summer. After the crisis starts to pass, and the Americans are able to start forming corps and to have them be real things, the Allies under Foch start to launch counteroffensives, and they start to, American corps and divisions start to contribute very largely in these. I should keep in mind too that part of the blunting the German attacks, the 2nd Division and 3rd Division both go into the line. The 2nd Division has the Marine Brigade, and they fight at Belleau Wood, famously there. This is probably one of those myths of World War I that we should always kind of repeat. When we talk about all these big, vast organizations, the Marines primarily made up 1/2 of one division. It was an Army division. They were included in the 2nd Division, and they were one brigade of one division, which is half of the infantry troops of one division. But because of secrecy rules during World War I, you couldn't say which American divisions were where in the fight in newspapers. So when you say the Marines were in a fight, you could say the Marines, though, because that was general. You could say the Army was in a fight, or the Marines were in a fight. And so when the Marines go into this, there's this impression that the Marines stop the Germans at Belleau Wood and then clear Belleau Wood afterwards, on their own, which isn't entirely true, but that's sort of the myth that comes out of this, and this leads to all kinds of problems later on with Army-Marine relationships. But regardless, the divisions do pretty well in the fight, and the interesting thing that happens is what had been a crisis in terms of shipping and moving troops overseas starts to become a real strength on the Allied side. By the summer of 1918, Americans are coming over in something like an average of about 250,000 a month, 250,000 troops a month. This is a lot of people who are flooding into this fight. Pershing now has the capability of forming forming his own independent army, field army, what would become First Army. In the mix of this, Marshall would, after his experience with the 1st Division and the initial fighting, and then they fight at a place called Soissons, but Pershing is like, hey, I'm tired of being a staff officer. I'm glad I've done well, but I know that in order to advance my career and in order to do what I want to do in this fight, which is lead troops in combat, I need a line command. Can I go to a regiment? Can I go to a brigade and take command there? And this funny thing happens. He puts in this request, and multiple of his superiors, including Bullard, all talk about how great he is as an officer, and then they deny the request for him to go to a line command. He's too good at his job. This is an interesting foreshadowing for World War II, by the way, when they talk about him taking command for D-Day, and he has superiors once again say he's too good for his job. In this case, it's the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, I can't spare you to go over there. But it's the same kind of idea. He's so good as a staff officer, and we have so few who are, no one is as good as him at this. So we need to find, he should absolutely be promoted, but we can't we can't put him in charge of a line unit because it'll be a waste. We have other people who can do that, but we have very few people who can do what he can do in terms of a staff. So what ends up happening is that he goes to the American Expeditionary Forces General Headquarters in the operations section there. So it's still a G3 under Fox Connor. And then he becomes this kind of free agent operations officer who bounces back and forth when First Army is created in August, formally, end of July, August of 1918. He ends up kind of bouncing back and forth as a G3 officer for both the AAF and for First Army.
So certainly he was frustrated by not being able to get his combat command, but did he take pride in being a good staff officer?
I would think that George C. Marshall would say that pride is a sin, and so the pride he took in it was very much. I think he took pride in being a very good teammate. I think I would say it that way, more than he did about how good he clearly was ambitious and smart and good about those things, but good at his job, no doubt about all of that. But I think part of what he saw as important about his job was being a good teammate, and that would not involve tooting his own horn. There's kind of one sort of exception, which we could talk about here in a minute, at the Meuse-Argonne, the movement to the Meuse-Argonne, but by and large, I think he was, can't emphasize enough how much of this required a team effort. As good as he was, he needed to work with other people, especially when they got to the higher levels. You can maybe get the idea that there's a G3 officer, but even the idea that he's having to bounce around, he's not the only one. One of his friends and colleagues, a guy named Walter Grant, is kind of with him, going back and forth between the General Headquarters operations staff and then also on the First Army one. So, because they needed people. They needed people to deal with all of the problems. They're so vast. It's almost beggars the imagination of what they were trying to accomplish in World War I on the Western Front.
Now, one of the big operations that would happen after he goes to the GHQ is the San Miguel operation. Can you talk about that, and what was his role in planning that?
Yeah, so this is a great one. So. Because of the counteroffensives, which drive back all the German advances of the spring of 1918, are all stopped and then driven back over the summer of 1918. And this, Americans have a key role in all of this. It's often kind of forgotten. We kind of leave that out of the story. But yeah, there's a lot of fighting that goes on. Regardless, the Germans are kind of fairly clearly at the end of their tether. They have to fall back to what is called the Hindenburg Line. It's sort of a misnomer. The Hindenburg Line is a line of defenses in depth. It's basically consists of 4 lines. It sort of spreads all along the Western Front. They're very well developed. They've used all the lessons of the war to set up this defense in depth, to try to sort of hold their ground, and then if they can blunt further Allied attacks, then maybe they can negotiate a peace to this. It's sort of favorable, and they can keep what they were after in the first place in World War I. Now, what happens is that Ferdinand Foch, as the overall commander, sees an opportunity in the summer of 1918. Remember, we said that the Americans had always envisioned that 1919 would be when the big effort happened, but because the Germans had so exhausted themselves, and because of the effectiveness of the counterattacks in the summer of 1918, Foch sees an opportunity and says, I want to launch a general offensive. And now he has the authority to kind of order this. And the Americans say, right on, we're in on that too. And Pershing says, and now I have a First Army that can contribute to this. And the Americans from day one, when they look at the Western Front, they see an opportunity in the Alsace-Lorraine area, Lorraine-Alsace area of the Western Front. This is the area it's kind of a backwater of France. It's only famous because of really of World War I. Sort of in the middle of this is Verdun, the famous place where the French had held the line, they shall not pass, and stopped the Germans from taking Verdun. Just south of Verdun is a salient in the line, a bulge in the line called, the tip of it is the town of Saint-Mihiel, and it's sort of like a V-shaped, a triangle-shaped bulge in the line. And the Americans say, hey, like, this is a good place for us to fight. We can go take this fight on here. The French hadn't been able to reduce the salient. The Americans say, this is a good spot for us, and it also allows an opportunity for us to attack some key strategic areas for the Germans on the Western Front. And if we are able to attack there, we can follow up that attack and drive into sort of the southern route into Germany proper. And so the Americans have this, from the very beginning, this is their kind of idea. When I say this very beginning, I mean in 1917 when they first surveyed the front, Fox Connor included. And now they have their opportunity. They say, okay, well, let's do this at Saint-Mihiel. We'll start the fight there. So they start the planning for this, and George C. Marshall ends up, this is where he's kind of a free agent bouncing back and forth. He goes and helps out the First Army. Now, First Army is, interestingly, First Army is commanded by John Pershing. He's also the commander of the overall AEF, so he's kind of wearing two hats at the same time. His chief of staff for First Army is a guy named Hugh Drum, who's often forgotten, but is, there's a fort named after him in New York, but otherwise people don't really remember Hugh Drum, but he's very, very good as the commander. There's a reason why him and Marshall work together very well. Anyway, in any case, Marshall and Walter Grant are put on the planning effort for Saint-Mihiel by Connor and Drum kind of working together. And they come up with this big plan to sort of pinch off the salient. So they don't attack the point of it, they attack two sides of it, and they come up with this big idea about how to do this. This is another case where Marshall ends up in a bit of a fight with Pershing about this because him and Grant really want a very extensive, a 14-hour artillery preparation before they launch this attack. Some people say, hey, we need surprise more than we need this big artillery preparation, and they say do very limited attack. Pershing settles on 4 hours as the bombardment. Marshall thinks it's a mistake. Pershing's right. It ends up going pretty well. It ends up going really well for the Americans. This starts in it's September 12th of 1918. They launch this attack. The Germans, this is kind of another sort of myth, hadn't exactly decided to abandon. They had an idea that they might leave the salient, and as it happens, the plan for leaving the salient if they're attacked is sort of half put into play, but then the German commanders say, you need to hold and fight them here, we can't let this happen. And so the Americans end up capturing tens of thousands of German troops, which is not an indication the Germans were leaving in any sort of hurry. It goes very, very well in a matter of a few days, and it goes very, very well, and they are able to reduce the Saint-Mihiel salient, flatten it out, and then there's some people who say, hey, we should continue this fight, but then other events intercede.
So as this fight is going on, he starts to shift his attention to another operation, starts to planning a big movement of troops where, in his memoir, he says, my final conclusion was that this order represented my best contribution to the war. What was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and what was his role in planning this movement? Okay,
so this is his bit of pride, right? This is probably his one example of pride in this, and it needs a little bit of explaining. So even before they actually launched the attacks, they had done all of the planning, they put the effort into place, they moved the troops to Saint-Mihiel and try to do it in as secret as possible. It goes okay for Saint-Mihiel. They do some deception operations and things to distract the Germans. But in the midst of all of this big, complicated effort, 3 American corps, a French corps, part of this fight, Hugh Drum meets with the First Army Chief of Staff meets with Marshall on September 8th. And he goes with his staff, meets with them on September 8th. So this is 4 days before the attack is about to launch for Saint-Mihiel on September 12th. And he tells him, hey, I know that our plan was to reduce the Saint-Mihiel salient and then start driving east towards into Europe. However, Marshal Foch met with General Pershing, and they decided they wanted to do something a little bit different. Foch wanted the problem with the American attack east from Foch's perspective, and you can kind of understand this if you look at a map. The Western Front at this point, there's this big kind of bulge that goes west from Verdun, and it heads out over across the Argonne Forest, and then up, and then turns north and heads towards the Channel. Right, so you kind of think of it as like a shelf almost. This bulge in the line. And Foch says, hey, if you Americans attack the way you're planning on attacking, you're kind of attacking away from where the rest of this general offensive is going to go. I want everybody to be doing concentric attacks. Everybody's sort of attacking towards a common middle. And so he suggests, and then eventually comes to an agreement with Pershing that turns into an order that the Americans attack north. Now he tries to incorporate the Americans back into a French army, and Pershing tells him that's a no-go. I'm going to keep an independent First Army. And so Pershing tells him, hey, you know what we can do? We can do that attack north. And so, so they're very close to each other, St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. So the way the Meuse-Argonne works is the Meuse is the eastern boundary, the Argonne Forest, which is better thought of as like a mountain range. And for us here in central Pennsylvania, it's not all that different from South Mountain or North Mountain, Blue Mountain kind of range. It kind of looks like that. It's pretty similar, although more broken. Heavily wooded, difficult area to fight in. So the Americans say, hey, we'll go over there and we'll do this fight. The problem is that Foch says, okay, well, I want it by the end of September. The Americans say, well, aren't we attacking at St. Mihiel here? That's like 3 weeks after, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks after we're launching this attack at St. Mihiel. And he goes, yes, that's right. And they go, okay. So Hugh Drum goes and meets with Marshall on September 8th and tells him, hey, we're going to need to start moving our forces from St. Mihiel, some of our forces from St. Mihiel to the Meuse-Argonne front. Means sort of like a 90-degree turn and then head 30 miles north to go to Meuse-Argonne, and we need to do it in secret. Marshall sort of famously gets this thing. He says, I can't think of an example in military history where you're about to launch a major offensive, and it's our first one, as First Army, and you're being told that you need to move troops you need to start moving troops to it for another offensive at this close of a time right after it. And some of those troops are going to have to start moving almost as soon as they start the fight in St. Mihiel, within a day of starting the fight at St. Mihiel, particularly artillery. And Marshall has this great story in there about how this upsets his equilibrium. And he kind of wanders around the headquarters and goes out for a walk and tries to figure out what to do about it. And he goes off and sits on a canal and stares at this canal for a while, sitting next to a French fisherman who's just throwing, he's got an old man who's got his line in the water at this canal. And he finally decides, I just have to get after this, after thinking about it a little bit, and he goes back to his office and starts writing. And he says it's his kind of his proudest thing. He actually saves it and puts it in his memoirs. It's the one order he brings home with him and saves for himself, and it's the start of this vast movement. And it works, right? It's this crazy thing. It works. I had no idea that St. Mihiel would go as well as it did. No idea they could do something like this, move an army that's in a fight, move large portions of an army, including the headquarters, over to another fight in another direction. As you're in the middle of your first fight, it's crazy. Now, the interesting thing, this is where the pride part kind of comes into this. He gives his order to Drum. Drum shows it to Pershing. Pershing says it's great, and he comes back. He says, "That's a dandy. You did a great job." Right? Everybody knows, hey, we got the right guy to put the right guy on this. The interesting thing is that it's only a portion of the movement to the Meuse-Argonne, and this gets at the complexity and the teamwork that is required in this. That problem is actually given to multiple officers. You see multiple names on this. One of the problems is that they have is, okay, so when we get there, we have to replace the French troops that are already in the line in this spot, in the Meuse-Argonne area, where they had been since 1915. And so they put another officer in charge of that. Another issue is that, frankly, the majority of these troops that are involved in the fight in St. Mihiel, they're not going to be able to, they're going to have to keep fighting in St. Mihiel for a while. They're not going to be able to make it over to the Meuse-Argonne area. So they have to bring in a whole bunch of divisions from other areas on the all along the Western Front. And there's another officer put in charge of that. So at the end of the war, Marshall ends up getting a lot of credit for this, and historically he's gotten all of the credit for this. And he wouldn't have even said he did all of it. He did a large portion of it. He had an extremely difficult portion of it. You guys think about the lines were all going east, going west to east to go to the St. Mihiel, and they has to go south to north. Think about the traffic jams that would happen there, and there aren't very good roads in this area of the fight. So he does an amazing job, but he doesn't do it alone. And I don't think he would say he did it alone, but it's kind of in the historical record, it sort of has come off as that he did this all by himself. But that's, I think, a misunderstanding of the nature of modern warfare. Nobody's doing any of this stuff alone. It requires the effort of a huge team, and Marshall's very good at getting the team together.
So at this point, he's been proving himself throughout bigger and bigger operations and larger staff problems and challenges. Eventually, the war does come to an end. November 11th, 1918, the armistice is signed. Where is he at that point? I mentioned at the beginning that he finishes as a colonel. Was he happy with where he ended up?
Okay, so where he ends up is the Meuse-Argonne goes. So we have to kind of back up into the Meuse-Argonne a little bit to sort of describe. He's an assistant in the operations office, in the operations section at the start of the Meuse-Argonne. So he's formerly in First Army. Now he's there permanently. He's not working for Fox Connor, the general headquarters. The Meuse-Argonne starts off very, very well, the attack. They pull off the surprise. They overrun the first lines. But remember, I said the Germans have this defense in depth set up. The problem that the Germans see, one of the reasons why they want to have the attack, the Americans and the French want to have the attack through the Meuse-Argonne area, and it's a joint or combined French and American attack, is that they're trying to get to the rail line that runs, one of the two rail lines that runs to the Western Front in the region of Sedan, the famous city of Sedan from the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans know that that's important. The terrain is terrible for an attacker. It's very good for a defender. The Germans build up their defenses in depth as best they can in this area, and it's a brutal fight. It's like a 13-mile deep defensive positions with the famous sort of Hindenburg line, kind of the second to last of the lines in this, but the most well-developed. It's important, too, to think about the Meuse-Argonne. I think most Americans think of World War I. They have an image. It's a very British image. It looks like Flanders Fields. These very sort of stripped out flat ground with these trenches, and there's rats, and they're flooded, and somebody blows a whistle and people come out of the trenches. It's not exactly like that in the Meuse-Argonne. The first line is kind of like that, but it's much more hilly. There's these hilly, rocky sort of hills, and there's mountains, and the Argonne itself is basically a mountain range. And then the defensive positions aren't the sort of trenches the way we think of them. They're more like interconnected foxholes is a better way to kind of think about it. Lots of artillery positions that are already dialed in to where they're attacking. The American attack goes very well at first, but keep in mind, they use all their experienced troops at Saint-Mihiel, and those guys that Marshall moves, they're coming in to be in reserve, by and large. Most of those guys come to reserve. That means we're putting in inexperienced troops in the front line, and they have the exact problem that they were worried about when they came up with this, which is why they wanted to wait until 1918, which is that the guys get through the trenches, they follow the very rigid orders to get through the first trenches, and then they don't know what to do when they get out into the fight. So it turns into a bit of a slog. Keep in mind at this point, too, that, and I feel like we can't get through this without mentioning that if the Germans had used the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, the flu of 1918, which is very famous these days because of our own pandemic issues, if the Germans had used that as a weapon of war, they couldn't have done it better. They didn't, but they couldn't have done it better than what happened to the Americans. If you look at the American casualties from the flu, they peak in October of 1918. A massive problem for First Army, and Marshall's part of dealing with all of this. In any event, Pershing becomes overloaded with the problem of dealing with First Army and being the AAF commander. He turns over command of First Army. They create a Second Army, put Bullard in command of that. He turns over command of First Army in October to Hunter Liggett, a terribly wrongly forgotten American great field commander. And then Hunter Liggett and Hugh Drum elevate. They take the standing G3. They move him out to a line command, and they elevate George C. Marshall to being the G3. The key operations, the head operations officer for First Army, which is the position he's in at the time of the armistice, and he gets First Army. He helps contribute to First Army running really, really well. There's some key command changes that happen in this. Throughout October, they battle into the Hindenburg line, so they don't have the problem for their final attack, which happens on November 1st, of having to fight into the trenches. They are already in them by November 1st. They do that by design. And so that November 1st is an open warfare exercise. And it goes stunningly well. They're able to cut the German rail line at Sedan. The Germans sue for peace, and you get to the armistice. And George C. Marshall had a lot to do with all of that. And it's a huge, complicated problem that he's a key part of throughout.
So as he finishes up the war, and at this point, as you mentioned at the beginning, promotions come to a stop. He finds himself in a particular position. Does he kind of appreciate what he has just experienced, or will it take time for him to look back and see the value of having been a staff officer during the war?
Well, geez, I don't think he can't help. He can't help but appreciate it, because one of the things that they do after the war, as soon as they can after the armistice, is try to capture sort of lessons learned. So he goes and gives a series of lectures around to the troops. So he explained to everybody what's happening. He helps work on the report of First Army. He helps Hugh Drum write the report of First Army. So he immediately goes into kind of reflection about what they did. And then after the war, he ends up writing the memoir, which he never wanted published, and tried to destroy all of the copies of. And then we happily found him in the family records later on. I think not until the 70s, I believe, that they actually found the memoirs, which has been a great boon to historians to get his story in there. So no, I think he had a pretty good idea of what he had done, and everyone around him had a good idea. And maybe the best evidence for this is that Pershing, eventually offers him to become his aide-de-camp after the war, which he ends up being his aide-de-camp from 1919 until 1924 or something like that. That he's there for a long time and becomes a close sort of advisor, which gives him all kinds of experience. And maybe that's a good place to sort of sum this up with George C. Marshall. He said, what his accomplishments in the war deserve historical recognition, on their own. And because he became what he became, we're doing this exercise now and trying to figure this out. I think somebody could still write a book about George C. Marshall in World War I, a whole book, and show a lot. But it helps maybe answer this question: how a guy who in his career never really had command of large line formations. He'd get some lower level commands throughout his career, but he never had command of a division, never commanded a corps, never commanded a field army himself. But he had experience with all of that, right? He understood, by working on the tactical problems, that he did at First Army and doing the training at our First Division. By doing the training at the lower levels with those guys, he had good experience with that. By working his way up and seeing all of the problems of armies on command and incorporating all of the different assets, artillery, air power, medical, logistics, all of those things in there, he could see he had learned something about that. By being part of a coalition and working with the French and the British to a lesser degree, but with the French a lot, he saw the importance of being able to do that. By getting into some of the debates about lack of preparedness and their attempts to redress that after the war, as an aide-de-camp for Pershing, which was Pershing's big issue as the eventual chief of staff in the Army. He saw all of the necessary requirements of a War Department at war. So this is a great example of a guy who went through every level, and maybe he didn't have command along the way, and all evidence indicates he probably would have been pretty good at it. But he did have experience at every level, and he really had a good idea of how an entire modern war effort worked. And I think that really came out of his World War I experience, and no doubt had an influence on his ability to be a chief of staff of the Army later in war.
Well, we've been speaking with Tom Bruscino. He's an associate professor of history at the Army War College. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.